Welcome to Just Relationships, the show that offers you concrete ways to make your relationships better. Whether it's your boss, your spouse, your children, or your friends, the quality of your relationships in life directly affects how you feel about yourself and the success you achieve. Your host, Dr. Duffy Spencer, a psychotherapist, telecoach, author, and seminar leader, will interview top experts to help you learn to manage this essential part of your life. And now, here's your host, Dr. Duffy Spencer.
Welcome to you. If you listened to last week, you would know that we were in part 2 of ethics and relationships. What makes a good relationship? What has ethics got to do with it anyway? Many people think of ethics as luxurious. I can't afford to be ethical. I have to pay the bills. What do you mean ethics? It's a jungle out there. So welcome back, Dr. Arthur Dobrin, Professor of Humanities, retired Professor of Humanities at Hofstra University, Ethical Humanist Emeritus of the Ethical Humanist Society of Long Island, being an ethical leader, and so many other things that you have done, Arthur. Welcome back, and thank you for coming back.
You're welcome, Duffy.
Yeah, so we had such a wonderful discussion last week and looking at all the facets of what it means to be ethical. And you had talked about anthropologically that people tend to agree cross-culturally about what makes a good person. And a good person is someone who cares about others, who, as Hippocrates said, at least do no harm, at least try. And at the end of last week's show, we looked at, how, is there such a thing as a white lie? And what if we have a value conflict between truth-telling and not hurting anyone's feelings? And we looked at media ethics and business ethics and medical ethics, political ethics. And I'm remembering something you said years ago because I am a member for decades of the Ethical Humanist Society of Long Island, about how people may try very hard to do right at work. Otherwise, they're afraid they'll get fired. And then they come home and they think, well, this is the place I can let my hair down and be the real me. And if I'm annoyed, I can just spit it out. And when you talked about how that's where we have to do the most work. And last week, we talked about the notion of delayed gratification and not just allowing oneself to blurt things out impulsively. So we left last week's show with if people hate their jobs and they feel they have to accept it, they can't think about downsizing. And now it's at least half of their waking life. And now they're coming home. And how are they feeling and how are they behaving? Fascinating. Ethics between intimates.
Yeah. Well, even the most intimate relationship takes place within a larger context. And that larger context is the world, the larger, wider world that we live in. So as you said, somebody may be coming home for work and they're bringing all that baggage with them into their personal relationships. Well, you really can't leave it at the door. We really can't split our personalities quite that way. Or compartmentalize. We can compartmentalize, but the barrier between the compartments is very leaky. So if you've been very miserable at work, you may try to hide it when you come home, but usually not very successfully. You bring it in and you bring it with you. You've had a hard day. The person, that hard day is still with you. So the larger context that maybe that you were referring to is the world that we live in that has values that may be contrary to the values that we think really are most important. Whenever I've done informal surveys with people in terms of what do you most value, inevitably, I most value my family. Again, there are always exceptions to these things. But by and large, by and large, people say what I most value is my family. I love my brother. I love my sister. I love my father, my mother, my spouse, my mate. Not everybody does, and there are some times in which we have to figure out which of those configurations are the ones that really work for us. But it is the close relationships, friends, top of the list, right? Friends, family. That's what people want. They say that's what I most value. Now, the other thing, what people really want out of life is to be happy. I think it's really the very neurotic person, or perhaps the psychotic person, who would say, you know what I want out of life? I really want to be miserable. I'm looking forward to a miserable life. People don't say that. People say, I want a happy life. Then the question is, well, how do you get there? What is it that allows you to get there? And there are two parts to this. One is the larger context, which I was just talking about, what happens to you outside of your intimate or personal relationships. And the other is what you do within your personal relationships. And both of those things need to be paid attention to. So last week we talked about the larger context, but it can't be completely divorced from the personal one. So if you come into your personal relationship and you're feeling miserable because what happened to you, in the workplace, or how you were treated in the workplace, or that you're constantly, the more you work, the further behind you feel, or the harder you work, the more miserable your relationships become. It's time to take a look at what is society telling us is important, and is that congruent with what we say is important to us? And if the two are not, and I think they often are not, then something needs to change. Either you need to say, look, the hell with my personal relationships. I don't mind being miserable with my friends. I don't care if I have no friends at all. Or you'd say, what do I need to do in the larger world so I don't come home being so miserable? What is the larger world telling me is important? And I think you hinted at this last week, Duffy, which is we live in such a materialistic world that we think that we always have to have more than what we presently have. And most of the time, that's simply not true. Most of the time, what we have will do fine. We don't have to have more and better. I say this coming perhaps from a perspective that most of your listeners don't have. I'll make that assumption. And that is, I've lived a couple of times in a very poor part of the world. For a couple of times, I've lived in Kenya, in East Africa. And the people that I lived with were people who lived in mud homes, who didn't have running water, who didn't have electricity. They were very happy people. I think most of us would say, I don't want to live in such circumstances. But if you could close your eyes and just imagine that there was running water, imagine that you could turn the electricity on by flipping a switch, and only looked at the people and the quality of the relationships that they had, and whether you thought that they were happy or not, I think we'd all conclude these were really people who were really very happy with their lives. And what made them so? And it wasn't true of everybody that I knew there, but the people we became best friends with, and this has now been over 50 years, and I can continue to say this, is that what made them happy is that they were so part of thick relationships. That is, relationships in which when you needed help, people were going to be there without question, unstintingly. These were people who were very cooperative. They worked together. They farmed together. They did their stone carving together. They lived near one another. They knew all of their children and their grandchildren. All the grandchildren called their uncles and aunts grandpa and grandpa. I mean, or a father and mother. And it was like, it was a wonderful set of relationships. Did they want to have electricity? Of course. And now many of them do. Did they want to have running water? Of course. And now many of them do. Did they want a house that they didn't have to rebuild every 10 years because it was only made out of mud and dung, and when it rained, it all pelted away? Yes, many of them now have houses that are made of cinder block. So things are changing there. I can only hope that they maintain the relationships and that they haven't been pulled into a more materialistic lifestyle, which is hard to resist. I understand that. I've always wanted more things, better things. But at some point, I have had to say, enough's enough. That's it. More isn't better. More, in fact, could be worse. So it's a matter of sorting out in our personal relationships from the outside what's interfering with it. Inside, internally, which I think is really much of your orientation, Duffy, is in terms of, let's assume everything is okay on the outside. We've sorted all of that out. What makes a personal relationship work? And I would say that it is respecting the other person as much as you respect yourself. It is understanding that the other person has interests that are just as important to them as your interests are to you. That what will make your life enriched in the long run is being able to work live side by side with someone else, where what they've accomplished is as important as what it is that you accomplish. That you take as much pride in what they do as you take pride in the work that you do yourself. That is, that it's really it's mutual, and if it's not mutual in the long run, it really can't be a good relationship because it fails on ethical grounds.
Yes, I think the basic principle for humanity is reciprocity.
Mm-hmm.
It's what happens. And so, you give crap to someone, you receive crap, and you give goodness, you receive goodness and love. And I just think, in sociology, there's a term called the mobility ethic, which is the belief that if I can be upwardly mobile, I should be.
Mm-hmm.
And if I don't care about being upwardly mobile, then I'm a slacker.
Yeah, or there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, something wrong. And in addiction circles, it's often referred to as the disease of more. Whatever the particular addiction might be, it's always about more. But as we talked about in last week's show, the needs are often false.
Mm-hmm.
Do I really need that brand new car, or do I need peace of mind and a sense of time off and tranquility and just space, just hanging out with my loved ones?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. So go ahead.
An image that I like in terms of recognizing that less can be more is the image of Michelangelo. When they asked him about his sculpture, he would say, I'd have a piece of marble. And then what I would do is I would chip away until I revealed what was really inside. So you need to get rid of the excess stuff to get down to the essence. And,
it's interesting because the evolution of humanity has to do with surplus. Mm-hmm. So when we were able to move from nomadic hunters and gatherers every single day trying to fill our bellies, going to find other animals and gathering plants. And when we finally, unfortunately, when we moved into horticulture and agriculture and started to corral animals, and all our food source was in one place, and we now had surplus. And then we needed pots to store the grain in, and we needed all this stuff so we could have our first villages, which became towns and cities. So it's interesting, chip away excess, and it's almost as if we got carried away with too much surplus. Yeah, and how much do you really need?
Sure.
When is enough enough? What is enough?
Yeah.
What is enough? So let's just say a person or a family or parents have decided, kids, we're going to downsize. We're moving into a smaller house. We're not buying those very latest style jeans for you. We want more time with you. Now, I know I'm going into a whole can of worms by talking about teenagers. Maybe we should not go there. Intimates, husband and wife, mates, I think is so important. But do you have any comments about dealing with teens?
Teenagers. Hold your breath and wait for the best. They won't be teenagers forever. I think teenagehood is fraught particularly in our society, because it's so extended. Traditionally you'd go from childhood into adulthood, and even as a child, you often were given real responsibilities that we don't think children are capable of handling, and they really are. So we've extended childhood, I think, unnaturally. And we've extended adolescence as this period between childhood and adulthood. And during that period, kids are trying to figure out, who are they? What do they really believe? And it means you need to be able to separate from your family to figure this out. You don't want to be simply a robot or an automaton within your own family. Figure out for yourself what's important. Most kids come around believing almost exactly what their parents believed to begin with, for better or worse. Sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. But during that period, kids are testing limits. They're pushing. How far can you go? And that's really difficult. It's difficult for parents to figure out, what do I let them experience on their own? What not? How do I provide safety for them when the kids are doing things that can very well be dangerous they haven't experienced before? And at some point, you have to go on the public transportation on your own, or you have to get behind the wheel of a car and drive on the highway for the first time alone. Those are very dangerous. They can be, or seen as very dangerous activities. But children the shackles have to be loosened at some point, and that can be very scary for parents. Again, if you look at what do you really value, recognizing sometimes there's a conflict in values. Well, here's the conflict that we're talking about with teenagers. On the one hand, you want to provide safety for your children. I mean, that is a prime task of parenthood every place in the world. Make sure that your children survive to adulthood. That's it. For some places, that's all that's required of a parent. Other places, more is required, but at least that. So on the one hand, you want to keep your children safe. The other is that you want your children to be their own people. Well, to be your own person, you have to sometimes take risks. And, then how do you find the balance between safety and autonomy? That's a real conflict for parents. But if you're aware of what the conflict is, and you can talk to your children about that, even though they may be very irrational at some points, most of the time, again, in the long run, not looking at the short run, not what's going to happen today or tomorrow, but what's it going to be when they're adults, most of the time it works out reasonably well.
Yes, and I like that. Don't hold your breath, hold your breath. What is it? When is a person an adult? In other cultures, there are rituals around that. In our culture, there aren't. So what their first intercourse, even their first ejaculation, their first job, their first driving a car, when are you an adult? And now they say the brain doesn't fully form until 25. And we have these things called STEM families where kids leave and then they come back, and the economy, and oh my goodness, it's so much. And yeah, the adolescence is extended. It is prolonged because of the cost of living and the desire for individual housing. That we should have that, being neo-local. That's a good thing. It's not necessarily a good thing. And also the need for higher education to survive. So the education itself is extended to get that latest competitive job. But ultimately,
some of these things are mistaken. We don't really need higher education for people to succeed in the way we think about that. It's not true every place in the world. We probably should put more of an emphasis upon trades as opposed to professions or white-collar jobs. We need that, and people can really do well. The problem is that we tend not to respect people who work with their hands. We think that white-collar jobs are more respectable and professions are even more respectable than that. But it doesn't have to be that. Those are value choices that we're making in society. So if you are somebody who truly respects the plumber and the electrician and your car mechanic and other people who, your life really is dependent upon them, if you really show respect for them, you're maybe this college is not necessary for your kid. There may be a whole other route that is less difficult to negotiate than figuring out how you're going to pay $40,000 or $50,000 a year for 4 years for your kid to get a degree, which they may or may not get a job, or if they get the job, they may or may not be happy with it. This is what I mean about the larger context. We have to pay attention to it. There may be things that we need to change in our society in order to make it easier for people to live a tolerable life with a teenager under the roof.
Yeah, and the white collar versus blue collar. And as you said, people who work with their hands are not respected. And one sociologist wrote a book called White Collar, where he really talked about they have a lot less power than blue collar people because they would snub their nose at being unionized. Mm-hmm. So I think of it as the white collar ghetto. You think you're rich, but you're really not enriched. And, again, what is rich and what is the essence of living?
The ultimate goal of people is to be happy. And if you keep on asking the question, what does it mean to be happy? And then sort out short-term happiness from long-term happiness, sorting out what is really valuable to you as opposed to what's discretionary or harmful to you. I think if you keep that question in mind, many of these things that we're talking about become more understandable. And if you understand them better, I think they become more manageable.
Yeah. And if you're not so culture bound,
mm-hmm.
If you can step outside of your culture and say, well, what is this about? Do I really believe that, as you said, 40,000 times 4, getting that degree, that makes me a better person or better than someone else? Yeah. So we have just a couple of minutes, Dr. Arthur Dobrin, and I the term codependent.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yes. So, toxic relationships and how can intimate relationships be not codependent, what I call interdependent, what is called rather interdependent, the whole idea of I need you. Is that okay to need someone I love? Can adults have dependency needs? Does that mean you're not an adult if you have dependency needs?
Well, we all have dependency needs. I depend upon having an adequate diet. I depend upon having a roof over my head. And I think psychologically, internally, spiritually, if you'd like, I have the need for another person. I think that's true. I absolutely need this. Am I dependent upon it? Yes, I'm dependent upon it. But it doesn't mean that the things that I'm dependent upon make me lesser or that I need to be lesser. There's also the whole question of equity, if you'd like, power, and that is that hierarchy, that all of those things need to also be part of the consideration. So while I am dependent upon the people who are most close to me, for sure, that doesn't mean that I've given them power over my life. And it doesn't mean I have power over their lives. It means I'm concerned about them and they're concerned about me. And a respectful relationship isn't one in which I use my power to get what I want out of somebody. And being dependent upon somebody doesn't mean that they necessarily have the power to manipulate me either. Dependency is not a bad thing. Depends on how it's used and what you mean by it.
Interesting. Like what we say about technology, it's neutral in and of itself. It's how we use it. So that's fascinating. I never thought of it that way. Dependency, right. And that's why I so love the term interdependency. And so many people don't understand what that means in an intimate relationship. So I usually give the example of a business partnership where two people can come in with very different sets of resources. and help each other and use each other in the best sense of the word.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the idea of equality, fairness, reciprocity, principles, the idea of disciplining oneself even within one's home. And as you said last week, the word discipline is so misused. And the root of the word discipline is disciple, which I'm a fervent believer of something. Mm-hmm. And I adhere to that belief, where in this case, Jesus and his disciples, the person. But if you think in terms of beliefs, values, strong belief in that, and the term values in action. And of course, when you look at values in action, then you have to look at values in conflict, and which is what you spent your career doing. So we have just a couple of minutes left, Dr. Arthur Dobrin, of a 2-part series. And the good news is that this will be podcast forever and ever. So if you can't hear...
I'm going back what I said yesterday.
No, everything you said is so mediated in the best sense of the word. How do I explain these very huge concepts in a way that brings into everybody's lives, how we apply it? Mm-hmm. And so to be fair, to be kind, to be respectful, to make I statements from the heart. This is what it's like for me, like I'm giving a weather report. And this is the impact you have on me. And what about you? What's your weather report? As you said last time, perspective taking, and to care.
Yes, absolutely. And to one of my favorite lines from one of my favorite poems is to be of use. I want to be of use to people that I care about, to things I care about. And one of the things I care about, aside from those people who are close to me, are those people who are not close to me, and also the world that I live in, the earth I lived upon. I mean, I have to care about that. Without those things, the people I most care about would have a harder life. And I want to make their life easier. So I want to be of use in making the world a better place. It makes me feel better in doing that, but that's not the primary reason. The primary reason is that I hope it makes a better world for all those other people that I care about.
Beautiful. And we will end on that note. Thank you so much, Dr. Arthur Dobrin. And come to the Ethical Humanist Society on Long Island in Garden City on Old Country Road. We'd love to meet you. And this is Dr. Duffy Spencer saying goodbye for now and wishing you great relationships.